I'm Jim Check. You're watching KelownaNow. With me again, Mario Canseco from Research Co. Doing all the polls. You just did a couple of polls, and the most important thing going on to us in British Columbia, of course, is the BC election. The writ drops tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yes. It looks like a very different race from the one people imagined was going to happen a year ago. We saw BC United reorganizing and trying to mount a challenge to the NDP. But now it's the Conservatives who are essentially neck and neck, a 2-point difference between the two main parties. The NDP at 44% of decided voters, the Conservatives at 42%, and the Greens way back at 10%. So in a way, when I look at the numbers, it reminds me of the election of 2009, when the Campbell Liberals headed into the writ dropping with a 4 or 5 point lead over the NDP. A level of support for the NDP that was significantly higher from what we saw back in 2001, for instance, and ultimately trying to figure out who establishes that emotional connection with voters to seal the deal.
Yeah, so and lots of drama in this one for sure, right? Because the BC United Party suspended its campaign, and then all the candidates kind of got orphaned, and then there's a bunch that are running. What factor do you think they're going to play in this race? Because there's a bunch that are going to run as independents now.
Well, I got to tell you, it makes my job significantly more complicated. Usually you don't have independents that are particularly credible or who are going to be climbing the charts. You look back at 2020, the top independent was a candidate named Jason Lum in Chilliwack, who's a very well-known councillor. He got 25% of the vote. It's not enough to win the seat, but it's certainly enough to allow a party to sort of come through the middle and win it. And I think when you look at some of the independents who are running, Tom Shepitka, for instance, he's got a high level of support. He could actually win the seat or get enough votes to allow for an NDP victory in that riding. Similar situation with Karen Kirkpatrick in West Vancouver, Capilano. And when you start to look at just how well organized some of these candidates are, they may not have the BC United machinery behind them, but if you knocked in thousands of doors before Kevin Falcon chose to fold the tent, you want to get your shot at it. And I think that is one of the reasons for them to say, I still want to do this. Now, one thing that could hurt them is when you get to the latter stages of an electoral campaign, people start to choose a government. So there might be voters out there who like their independent candidate, but are thinking, do I really want the Conservatives to get in, or do I want the NDP to continue in power? And then you gravitate towards voting for either of the options. So,
and even in the Okanagan, we have lots of independents that are fairly well known in the Okanagan too. That have all they had a press conference just recently. Ashley Ramsey, Stephen Johnson, and Dr. Humer were three of them. There's somebody else here as well. And they've all said they're going to run as independents. So that really kind of muddies the waters a bit for like an NDP straight conservative runoff. I think they're very popular in this community.
Well, and it's the kind of thing that is going to cause some troubles for the Conservatives. I think they were coming in with the impression that Kevin Falcon had discussed this with his caucus, had agreed on candidates stepping away and endorsing their Conservative rivals. It happened in a few ridings, and in others they took the BC United candidate and ran it. But it's not the scenario that they thought was going to happen. If you have a United candidate saying, I'm just going to run as an independent and see what happens, and you could have a situation where the NDP gets to 35, 36% of the vote, similar to the total they had in 2020 in some of those ridings. But with the BC Liberal total from 2020 dropping by 14 or 15 points and the Conservatives gaining, then that seat is going to be orange.
Yeah. And then I imagine the independent candidates would hurt the Conservatives more than would hurt the NDP.
By far, because part of what we are seeing is the notion that you wanted to have a free enterprise coalition stitched together again, try to make sure that you had a united front to fight the NDP candidates in those ridings. And now you have a division of the vote. Maybe you want to vote for the Conservatives on policy, but you really like your independent candidate who used to be your MLA or who knocked on your door a couple of months before as a United candidate who you were willing to support. And now that is not going to be put into the same bucket in a way. Yeah. And that could enable the NDP to win those seats.
They may look back on that day when they could have, as a missed opportunity to kind of do a better job of communicating with the candidates that were orphaned.
Well, and you go back to the situation that we knew about back in December. There was an opportunity to actually seek that unity, to try to talk about a united list of candidates and to present a front that was completely united instead of the situation that we were subjected to, which is BC United folding the tent a day after they present their forestry platform. This is also why this election is so unusual in that sense. I mean, we do have the usual components of the center left and the center right clearly defined for the voters who are more ideological. But we have a party that a year ago was in fourth place, very distant, didn't know much how to organize. It wasn't even clear if they were going to be running a full slate. And it's the first campaign, both for John Rostad as leader and for David Eby as leader of the NDP. So the one who has the most experience on this, albeit in a campaign where we didn't knock on a lot of doors because of the pandemic, is Sonia Furstenau.
Right. So you did a poll, and it looks like that they're very close in the poll, the BC Conservatives and the NDP. But you also did a poll on popularity of premiers, and David Eby did quite well in that as well. He tied with Danielle Smith.
That wasn't us. That might have been somebody else.
Oh, was that somebody else that did that?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a poll done, and it showed that Eby came across as a very popular premier.
Well, what we've seen is, his numbers when we asked were at 51%. He's always been a little bit higher than 50%, with the exception of the poll we conducted in late July, where he was at 48%. So there's been a consistent level of support, which is a little bit higher than the voting intention that the NDP gets. And this is interesting because it shows that maybe you're not convinced about the NDP, but you're not looking at David Eby as the person who is making things worse. I mean, you look at other places. We could look at the federal scene, for instance, where the level of support for the Liberal Party is similar to the level of approval that you have for Justin Trudeau. It's nowhere near the numbers that John Horgan was getting. In the eve of the 2020 election, his approval was 65%. I don't think we're going to see anything remotely close to that over the course of this campaign for either Eby or John Rostad. But it also shows the complexity of trying to establish that emotional connection when you didn't have a mandate. And this is what David Eby is trying to get in this election. It could have happened earlier. We've seen examples of this with Alison Redford in Alberta. But it also can go very badly, like it did for Carrie Stephenson in Manitoba. So trying to establish that connection when you're the leader of the party, you won a leadership race, now you want to get the votes of the people. It's always a gamble. You never know what is going to be happening unless you establish that emotional connection.
Yeah, this isn't a race that a person would want to bet on yet, right? I mean, it's fairly tight, and anything can happen too. But one thing I think that the opportunity to fix the mess they've made is gone. I think once that writ drops, that's who's ever on that ballot at that point is on that ballot, right? So,
well, they have until September 28th at 1 p.m. to remove their name, and I think this might happen with some independents. I think once you realize how much money this is going to take, the fact that you're no longer supported by a party and have the structure or the lists of telephone numbers to call or doors to knock on, that might deter some of the independents from actually carrying forward with this. And it also allows us to see whether the Greens run a full slate, because I think that is also going to be crucial. Do they prefer to spend their money in 6 or 7 ridings where they can actually emerge victorious, or do they want to run a full slate like the Green Party used to do federally? And time has shown us that it's not always the best strategy.
They kind of waters it down a lot, right? So instead of focusing on a few key points, right? So
and this is how Elizabeth May got elected the first time. We're going to focus on this riding in Vancouver Island, and everybody else is just going to have to do with the tools at their disposal. But we're spending a lot of money to get me elected because we need a voice in the legislature instead of running in every riding, even in places where you definitely don't have a chance of winning.
I imagine the polls have kind of had David Eby change some of his policies, because we've seen some of his policies kind of bend a little bit in this last little while. So he's kind of, I guess, trying to bend into that center vote too, I guess.
I think it's a combination of factors. One of the reasons why I think this happened is if you take the carbon tax out of the equation before the rate is dropped, you minimize the opportunity for, let's say, for the sake of argument, Pierre Poilievre showing up at a John Rostad campaign rally. We know how popular the federal conservatives are. They're at 50%. Right. We never saw that level of support for Stephen Harper. So by signaling that you're going to be tinkering with the carbon tax a little bit, it takes away the opportunity for the local BC Conservatives to try to hitch their wagon to the extremely popular federal Conservatives. It's probably going to make some of the environmental wing of the NDP upset, but it's also an opportunity to try to steer clear from something that is going to be defined by the carbon tax. We just saw Pierre Poilievre urging MPs to vote down the government and call a carbon tax election. That is going to be top of mind for the federal Conservatives, and I think the NDP is trying to steer clear from that and say, we might think about this, we're thinking of specific issues that we can tinker with, but we don't necessarily want to talk about this in the middle of the campaign.
How big do you think Pierre Poilievre will play in this election for Rustad? Do you think that that's kind of like his secret sauce? That's the biggest kind of like backstop he has, kind of?
Especially because of how popular they are. We haven't seen numbers like this since the Canadian Alliance under Stockwell Day, and that was 24 years ago. There's a way in which particularly the younger voter is connecting with Poilievre, and this has a lot to do with the way in which they've decided to establish that emotional connection. Lots of social media ads, lots of YouTube videos, quick sound bites that get to the point and that get people to know who he is without necessarily having all the policy behind it. And this is why the Conservatives are doing so well across the country. They're connecting with younger voters who want a solution to the housing crisis. And it's working because they're abandoning the Liberal Party. They're not looking at the NDP as their home. This is a group that is traditionally more center-left and is looking at Pierre Poilievre as the vehicle for change. So if you can try to replicate something like that, even if their styles are very different, Poilievre is more boisterous, John Rustad is more calm, cool, and collected. But if you can have a little bit of that aura that is making 50% of decided voters in the province say, I want to vote Conservative in the next election, that is definitely going to help the BC Conservatives.
I guess there was some hope from the Conservatives that when Jagmeet Singh tore up the confidence, or the agreement there, that supply agreement, that he could force an election in this confidence vote on next week. It doesn't look very likely anymore.
No, it certainly looks complicated. I don't think the Bloc is going to go for it. The cynic might say that it's related to the pensions that are going to kick in early next year and they don't want to jeopardize that. But there's also no reason to essentially call an election because the leader of the opposition wants it. I think they also don't want to be seen as effectively very weak by doing whatever Pierre Poilievre wants to do. And it also enables a little bit of time to try to figure out what happens with their own provincial political scene. We don't know what's going to happen with the Liberal leadership. And we've seen the Bloc Québécois doing a little bit better, but the Parti Québécois doing remarkably well. And it's part of what happens sometimes with governments that build their reputation on their pandemic management. John Horgan may have faced something like this if he had still been in power, but this is what is happening with François Legault. I steered you through the pandemic, and now you're upset about a bunch of things that we can't solve immediately. And the solution that is being put forward by the other side is, why don't we flip with sovereignty again?
Yeah, do they not run the risk, though, Jagmeet Singh and the Bloc of really ignoring the voice of Canadians? You can see it in the polls that most Canadians want to vote. And then do they run that risk? We see that the NDP losing ground. And does the Bloc run that risk too by ignoring the voice of Canadians? I know it's right for them, but I don't know if it's right for Canadians.
Well, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing when you think about it, right? You could be the one who topples the government and people are happy because they have a chance to vote. But it's not in your best interest politically. I mean, we've seen the NDP dropping. The approval rating for Jagmeet Singh dropped below 50%. It was actually at 42% the last time we checked. So it's starting to drop to levels that we haven't seen before, because we used to see people saying, Jagmeet Singh is great, I like his leadership, but I'm not going to vote for the NDP. And now they're getting it from both sides. His numbers are down. This is obviously before the incident that was widely reported over the past couple of days ago. But it's also related to what happens with the party as a whole. And with the NDP at 17%, there is no incentive for them to try to force a new election. People might actually send those numbers a little bit lower.
Because the frustration of voters, though, could, like by him hanging or keeping Justin Trudeau in power, that frustration may rub off onto the voters and even put more people towards Pierre Poilievre.
Well, and it's something that, people look at the agreement that the NDP and the Liberals had, and we tested how Canadians felt about it from start to finish. And there was a moment when we got closer to 50% of Canadians saying, this makes sense. This is working. I like the promise of a pharmacare program and a dental program. But when they came out with the two policies, people became more dissatisfied. People wanted a pharmacare that took care of their medication. And if your medication is not included in the plan, you're not likely to be happy with what was accomplished. And the threshold for the dental plan seemed to be a little bit higher than it ultimately was. So, it's a great idea to have some of those programs in place. But Canadians who don't see benefits to themselves or their families are more likely to say, this is what we got from this relationship. We might be better off if we just force a new election.
Yeah, let's. We don't have too much time. I don't want to take too much of your time. I do have on 1:30. Across the border, that's a race that's heating up as well, and you're watching that race as well. What do you see right now, and what's it looking like down there?
I think there's a couple of factors. Usually in U.S. politics, you talk about the October surprise. Like there's something that happens, some video of Donald Trump saying something, or some announcement, or some picture, or George W. Bush being stopped for drunk driving
right.
Years before the election. There's always something. This time it seems to have happened in September with the revelations about the candidate for governor in North Carolina. This is a state that hasn't gone for the Democrats in a long time. They came close in 2004 when John Edwards was the vice presidential nominee, but this effectively has the chances of bringing down the level of Republican support. People who are upset because their governor candidate is not great end up staying at home. And this presents an opportunity for the Democrats to really double their resources and try to win North Carolina. Aside from that, as long as the Democrats hold on to Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, they can afford to lose Arizona and Georgia and not win North Carolina. And we would still see Kamala Harris elected president. I think the lesson from 2016, which they applied in 2020, is don't stop campaigning in the blue states, or states that used to be blue and went for Donald Trump back in 2016. There's definitely been a change in the way in which the race has developed also at the national level. But we know how the Electoral College works. It's ultimately about connecting on those battleground states. And that would be the key to the victory for either party.
Yeah, it's a very complicated race down there in all different states and different things. And a lot of people vote along their party lines and stuff like that. But it's definitely an interesting race down there for sure, too. And then a second assassination attempt as well. That's kind of, I don't know if that...
Well, it's the kind of thing that can help rile up the base. I think part of what we had was a debate in which Kamala Harris was able to connect with the base, certainly at a higher level, talk to independents with specific policy morsels, $50,000 for small business. This is the kind of thing that people will talk about. The Republican side is only talking about edible pets, which is probably not what they wanted to be talking about 3 days after the meeting.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's starting to give away stuff too, right? So I don't want to take too long. I do want to catch up with you again, maybe in 2 weeks as we're in the middle of this race in British Columbia. I think that'd be a really good test to see where it's going. I know that the Premier's got his bus and he's headed out today and he's starting to work the province. I don't know if John's got a bus and if he's out there as well, but I'm sure the door knocking is going to pick up pace here.
Apparently the debate's going to be on the 8th, so we can talk that Friday.
Yeah, that'd be great. And thank you, Mario. And we thank you for watching Kelowna.
Yeah. We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. KelownaNow, local, independent. News you can trust.